The Cleansing of the Temple by Dominikos Theotokopoulos, who from now on I will call El Greco. So you can tell by his name he is Greek, but he is a Spanish Renaissance painter who was a Mannerist. So let me break down a little bit of his biography, because El Greco is a little bit confusing and a fascinating artist, and we will be looking at him today, and 2 days from now we'll be looking at another one of his masterpieces. So let me give you a little bit of his history. El Greco was born on the island of Crete, so he was Greek, and he was trained as a Byzantine icon painter. So Byzantine art was known for being very solemn, kind of rigid. Things were presented in very specific ways. He decided that he wanted to travel to Italy. This would have been during the Renaissance, and he wanted to learn what he could from the Renaissance masters, in particular Titian and Tintoretto. So he went to Venice and spent a lot of time there, worked with both of them, and while he was there was introduced to the Mannerist style of painting. Now the Mannerists were a reaction against the high Renaissance works. Reaction against isn't quite right, but they were pushing back on some of the principles of high Renaissance art. In particular, high Renaissance art is exemplified by equilibrium of form and proportions and perspective. Beauty is the ideal, perfection, not reality, but perfection. So yes, they wanted everything to look real, but perfectly real. It's not like if I went and looked at a tree and drew every leaf exactly, they would be marred, they would have brown spots. These were idealized leaves in the high Renaissance, and their paintings are flawless and gorgeous. And there was some pushback against that among the Mannerists, and they deliberately created compositions that were out of balance, where the scale was confused, where the spatial relationships between figures were crowded or spread out too far, where we were forced into the picture plane. They elongated their figures. They made flesh tones unnatural. So the Mannerists were a pushback against the ideals of the Renaissance. And while El Greco was in Venice, he began to combine the worlds of the Byzantines, the Venetians, the Mannerists, and mysticism into his own unique artistic language. He left Venice eventually and moved on to Toledo, Spain, to fulfill a commission. And in this new environment, he found an audience for his unique style and a place to develop his dramatic visions without the critics that ruled Italian art, where it was very specific what was acceptable and what was not. After he died, Baroque had come fully into being, and the Baroque movement is what we see in our Van Dyck painting. And as the Baroque movement rose in popularity, El Greco's works were seen as very strange, and he kind of sank into obscurity. When most people see an El Greco, they don't place him time-wise with the great Renaissance painters. The painting we're looking at today was painted in 1600, but you would think it was painted hundreds of years later because it looks very modern. He boldly rejected the naturalism. There were Mannerist painters before him, but they didn't take it as far as El Greco did. His works appear to have just been pulled right out of time, and to remind us that art history is not a straight line, that at every time in the history of art, there have been outliers who experimented more than their contemporaries and who were disruptors in the art world and pushed certain things. But El Greco basically fell into obscurity for nearly 300 years until he was brought back to the forefront of the art world by the likes of Manet, Cézanne, Picasso, Jackson Pollock. The modern artists saw in him a kindred spirit, and they traveled to see his works and brought him back to the attention of the public. He's a Renaissance painter with a very modern feel. El Greco deformed the shapes of both his buildings and his figures on purpose with a theological goal. He wanted the viewer to escape realism. And in doing that, he felt you could find a gateway to the divine. Now, this work, the cleansing of the temple, he did 4 different times that we know of. There might be more, not everything he signed. And so not in recent years, we keep finding new pieces that are being attributed to El Greco, but we know of at least 4 works on this theme. The cleansing of the temple was a very popular theme in this period with both Protestant and Catholic artists. Remember, we're just moving out of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, a lot of reforms going on within the Catholic Church. The idea of cleansing the temple and purging the excesses and coming back to the core of what Christianity is was popular across the board during this time. So paintings of this to be put in churches was a theme that resonated with many audiences at the time. The Catholics had responded with the Counter-Reformation in the Council of Trent, and El Greco was Catholic. And the council reaffirmed some of the key doctrines, but they also began to reevaluate a lot of practices and to purge those. And as Christ drives the money changers out of the temple, we see that money, power, politics is at the root of the problem that Christ is addressing, and that the Catholic Church is addressing in El Greco's age. And so El Greco has placed this scene not in the ancient temple of Jerusalem, but in a Renaissance palace. And he did this quite intentionally. He was moving the story into his own social setting. The message that he was giving was that every new generation of believers has to ponder how the influence of power, money, and politics might be distorting the gospel and negatively impacting the health of the church. So it raises the issue of, if El Greco were alive today, where would he have painted this scene? Where would he have set Christ purging the temple? It's not a mistake that he has painted him. He knows that this Renaissance palace is not what the temple looked like. He's making a point. When we look at the painting, Christ is the hub of the work, and everything else is rotating right around him. He's obviously right in the center. There's a lot of movement. He's got one arm raised, one down. He's holding the whip of cords. And that arm that he has in the air is the arm of punishment and judgment, and the other hand is down, kind of comforting the apostles who are on the other side of the painting. The painting is divided in half. And on the left-hand side of the painting, we see the den of thieves, the money changers in the temple that he is driving out. And they are seen in various states of cringing, trying to escape. There's a lot of movement going on and a lot of almost to the point of terror on their faces. And then if you look on the right side of the painting, you see the disciples. There's John, the beloved disciple. He's the one dressed in white with a hand to his chest. He's always presented as the youngest disciple when you look at a painting. We see Peter is the one kneeling in the very foreground of the painting. And interestingly, Peter, again, this is not because El Greco wasn't capable of scale. He was very capable. But he has painted Peter. Peter's huge. If Peter stood up, he would be bigger than everyone else in the painting. He's not to scale, but he's the one in the front. And he and all the disciples are watching the action very closely, but not with the terror of the people on the left-hand side of the painting. Christ in the center is the only figure in red. It's a very voluptuous kind of figures. All of them are large and solid and painted with a religious intensity. El Greco's paintings can almost sometimes make it look as if the people are swirling into transforming into spirit. We have some of that in this painting with the Christ figure, as if he's not completely connected to the ground, if you look at that. Now, you will notice when you look at this that there's no animals in this picture, which in the stories there are. El Greco was not trying to make an exact, biblically accurate picture. He was looking to make spiritual points. He believed otherworldly imagery was a better aid to spiritual understanding and faith than realism and an exact representation. He wanted to move your spirit into the divine story. He wasn't as worried about factual accuracy. So we have the lack of animals. It's been suggested that some of the reasons that he hasn't included them, and we have to understand that Most of these Renaissance painters actually had a theologian who was working alongside them and informing them as they went along of theological points and doctrinal arguments so that the paintings could include those in them. It's particularly works that were destined to be displayed in churches. Some have postulated that the animals not being there is because animal sacrifices will no longer be needed. Christ is about to go to the cross, and so he went into the temple and freed all the animals because they would no longer be needed as sacrifices because he was going to be taking on the sins of the world, and so they would no longer have to give their lives. So he freed the animals. There are two bas-reliefs in the very back of this building. If you look on the left and on the right, you'll see them back there. They allude to the twin themes of punishment and redemption. The one on the left is the expulsion from paradise, which echoes the theme of punishment in the painting, which is very obvious in this one. The one on the right is the sacrifice of Abraham's son. And so in that story, Abraham's told to sacrifice his son, and at the last moment, God intervenes and provides an animal to be sacrificed in place of Isaac. So Isaac is saved, but a sacrifice is made. That relief is foretelling the crucifixion of Christ that's to come.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to like this video by giving us a thumbs up below, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss great commentary on classic works of art. KellyBagdanoff.com is your source for great content and curriculum, as well as devotional materials using the medium of art. Make sure you visit and subscribe. Pablo Picasso said, "Art washes from the soul the dust of everyday life." So take a moment to share this video because art is too important not to share.
See you later, alligator.